Hi everyone, and thanks for subscribing to my channel. Today I want to speak about the pending peace in Ukraine and the implications geopolitically and how it's going to impact us across Europe and here in Ireland, which is really important. Now, we've seen over the last number of days Micheál Martin doubling down on more commitments to Ukraine. Over 50 million euro he signed off on in the last week to give over to Ukraine. That's over 130 million euro so far has been handed over in so-called non-lethal military aid. And also we've seen the push towards more war in Ireland and more push towards the European army, and not to mention the amount of money that's been spent, over billions of euro that have been spent on housing Ukrainian refugees right across Ireland, over 112,000. Now, we've seen the push for peace by the Trump presidency over the past number of weeks. We saw the meeting in Saudi Arabia headed up by Marco Rubio with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister counterpart from Russia, and also we've seen Europe being sort of pushed around by JD Vance, the vice president, a number of weeks ago at the Munich Security Conference, decrying the lack of democracy across Europe and the drive towards authoritarianism. We've seen that here in Ireland too, with the drive towards the hate speech bill and also attacking people's freedom of expression. And also what's really fascinating with this has been the drive towards more war by the European Union. Again, we've seen this war being an unwinnable war that's been registered by so many people involved in this. We've seen the propaganda from the media to say the Russians had shovels and all this type of nonsense, to say they'd be beaten within weeks. And this is the same sort of narrative that we've come to expect from the media, who are just do the work of the rotten and corrupt political establishment, who represent the interests of the super wealthy rather than the interests of ordinary people. And we've seen the drive, as I said, towards more war, and the European Union and the European leaders have been more than able to push ahead with this. But of course, fundamentally, what the drive has been across Europe, with the deindustrialization of Europe due to the proxy war in Ukraine and with the Biden regime, supported that, and we're benefiting and profiting from it through the involvement of their families, such as Hunter Biden and many more of the members of the family with Burisma. And of course, the oligarch who owned Burisma was the guy who brought Zelensky to power, who was elected in Ukraine on a platform for peace, remember. Now, over the last number of weeks, we've seen the language escalate between the two countries, talking about calling Zelensky a dictator. And at the same time, we see a meeting being arranged this coming Friday in Washington, D.C. in relation to solving some sort of moving towards a peace agreement. Now, the conditions for this peace agreement are important because fundamentally it's all about the money for the United States. It could be up to $1 trillion of rare earth minerals and resources will be given over for the big corporations, yet again, in a payment for in terms of their support. And maybe perhaps a lot of European leaders have been looking for the backstop for the Americans to keep supporting the continuation of a conflict with Russia into the future. Perhaps this is some form of Minsk III agreement that could be negotiated over the next period of time, because the US know it's an unwinnable war, and across Europe it's been deindustrialized, and of course it's caused a massive cost of living disaster for so many people right across Europe and here in Ireland too. We saw that with the fallout of the sky high energy costs, and of course the rampant profiteering that takes place by these energy oligarchs that the Irish government represent and those across the European Union with their neoliberal agenda represent. But what's really important with this has been the drive that Trump has always had towards China and pivot towards China. And this would happen in the next period of time, I'm almost certain. We've already seen the language coming out from the Secretary of Defence in the United States, Pete Hegseth, who said that there should be a division of labour in the context of pushing the military-industrial complex across Europe to support themselves and defend themselves. That's what the whole mantra is about, defend themselves from Russia. And at the same time, we've seen the push, the pivot towards China. And also we've seen the UK increasing their defence spending up to 2.5%, intends to be probably 3% by 2030. And many more European countries, such as Ursula von der Leyen, who has also said that they would be suspending the fiscal rules to push ahead with more spending on the military industrial complex. And this is interesting because initially the United States would benefit from this, of course, by buying weapons and arms from the United States from companies such as Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and all these military industrial complexes who'll make a massive fortune, while ordinary people will be cut back with their public spending programs across the European Union. And this is austerity Mark II, that they've been dying to get in post-COVID, post the lockdowns. We saw that as well, where the biggest transfer of wealth went towards the billionaires, and they're doing exactly the same now with this war in terms of cutting down on basic public expenditure, because they'll make it about an existential threat from Russia. But if anybody knows their history in terms of conflicts here, they know about what happened in 2014 with the Maidan coup. We know about the US pumping up this regime for years and years. They did the same previously in Georgia, despite what some parts of the media keep telling you about these invasions and attacks and who started them. But we know about the Budapest Memorandum, for instance, in '94, that agreed on Ukraine remaining neutral. It was agreed by the Clinton regime. And but what's happened to that? We've seen a drive towards more militarism and NATO. And of course, it's all about the money and all about the resources and the minerals. And that's what it's about across Russia, for instance, one of the most expansive countries in terms of minerals and energy resources across the world. So this has been a massive drive, a massive push towards this. And at the same time, we see here in Ireland how the suffering will continue in the drive towards more war and erosion of Irish neutrality, initially starting now with the scrapping of the triple lock, what the Irish government intend on doing over the next period of time. But of course, as I said, it's all about the money for these elites. They all represent the interests of the very wealthy and themselves, essentially. I'm sure Trump's family might benefit as well from the deals that are taking place in these rare earth resources and minerals and coal and many more resources that are being used across Ukraine, for instance, with this deal that'll be signed in Washington, D.C. at the weekend. And of course, this will play to the rhetoric, for instance, to say we'll get payback for this war. And America, of course, can't, at the moment, being a dwindling empire, can't fight battles on maybe 2 or 3 fronts. So that's why they'll probably pivot to China, maybe park this maybe for a number of years. Let's wait and see how that develops. But again, he's got his wish in terms of Europe beefing up the defence forces, moving towards more militarism, and will be an able lapdog for Washington, D.C. So who will benefit? It's quite plain to see. And some of the European leaders are up in arms over this. And that shows the fractious nature of Europe in terms of the division within those European leaders and the pressure that's coming from below. We saw recently with the German elections, Friedrich Merz being the new chancellor there, who is an ex-BlackRock guy, a total globalist, and having a bit of a conniption with Trump, for instance, of what he's doing. But again, they're all on the same team. They have their inter-rivalries in terms of geopolitically, but at the same time, it doesn't really offer anything better for the interests of ordinary working class people. And that's what's really important. It's great that the war is stopped. It's great that it's stopped. But the unfortunate thing is, you see Ireland, for instance, ploughing along with this narrative, and they'll be doing it over the next period of time, pushing towards more war. We should be stopping funding going to Ukraine. We should have no hand, act or part in any form towards militarism or war. We should be looking for peace and using our voice for diplomacy. And that voice should grow louder and louder. So please share my videos around what's going on and tell you the truth to what's going on in terms of the context in the war and how it impacts us here domestically in Ireland. And this is the same narrative that will come time and time again through the media. We've never learned our lesson from jingoistic, militaristic, warmongering, fear-mongering that will constantly be pushed down people's throats through all forms of the media. But we need to stand up for the needs of ordinary people, and ordinary people, working class people, are the ones that suffer most because of wars, and are the ones who die, as I said, suffer the misery of wars. But it's important that we stand up for our independence, our sovereignty and our neutrality. In this crazy world, essentially, we need to stand up for a voice of reason, for a voice of peace, for a voice of sensibility against the constant drive that will always serve the interests of the oligarchs. Now, what's important across Europe also is, as I said, austerity Mark II will be coming. Already Mario Draghi has written a report on competitiveness. This is part of it, to beef up the military industrial complex, initially profit the warmongers in Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and of course they'll do the same across Europe as well. And also, what's really important around this has been the push towards more money for these people at the very top end of society who'll profit time and time again. The BlackRocks, the Vanguards, the State Streets, and many of those Wall Street investors who will profit from the misery and war of others. While they're jumping up and down about getting paid back for the war, you'll never pay back on the lives that are lost, the people that have been injured, people that have been decapitated because of this war. And yet we have van der Leyen at the helm of the European Commission who's pushing this agenda as well, and even looking at suspending fiscal rules. They never suspend the fiscal rules for basic human rights such as housing, such as the energy crisis and the health crisis. They don't suspend fiscal rules for that, but it's okay when it comes down to their agenda, pushing the neoliberal project, pushing the interests of the private equity firms against the interests of ordinary people. That's who the European Union represents, the big corporations at the expense of ordinary people. So we need to stand up, speak out against it, and say no more funding to Ukraine, and use our money for the good of our people here in terms of a housing disaster with over 15,000 people homeless, 40 people died in the streets of Dublin last year. That's where money should be spent. We should be putting the interests of our country and our nation first, not the interests of any supranational institution that is eroding our independence, our sovereignty, our democracy, our neutrality day by day by day. Thanks for the support of my videos. Please share my videos far and wide as well, and please press subscribe. So from Dublin, Slán, take care. Bye bye.